Another blow to the Iran-led axis in Syria, rebels entering the city of Hama after retaking Aleppo, a stunning and shocking offensive, and they appear to be pushing towards Damascus. Iran's proxies crippled by Israel in both Lebanon and Gaza, and now Iran is trying to shore up its influence in war-torn Syria. But just how far is the Islamic Republic willing to go to keep its grip on Syria, and how will that impact what happens next in the nation? Helping us answer these questions is Qutaiba Idlbi, a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, the director of the Syria Initiative. He's also a Syrian who was detained multiple times by the Assad government. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Qutaiba Idlbi joins us now from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Eye for Iran. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Qutaiba, you fled Syria in 2011. That was the year that the civil war was launched, one of the greatest humanitarian disasters of our time. Now, before we get into all the different players and the Iran angle in all of this, I think it's really important for our audience to get to know you a little bit and why your heartbreaking journey and your incredible story of triumph and success gives you so much critical insight into what is happening right now as we speak. If you're comfortable sharing, could you please tell us what happened to you, your family, your friends, and your community during this period of time?
Sure thing. I grew up, of course, in Syria to a more lower class family in Damascus. I think I was luckier than others. My father was very politically involved in Syria, since the 60s and 70s. He was actually detained 8 times between 1964 and 1981 because of his political activism, especially during university, right after. And it was those basically 15 or 20 years, it was the beginning of the life of the Ba'ath Party as a ruling party in Syria. So I was, I think, lucky in a sense, growing up around him, hearing a lot of, from his story, from his experiences, even though, interesting enough, it was kind of like indirect. So I think there was a level of fear in Syria to the extent that even my own father wouldn't tell us what he did. I think I became more politically aware because of the books we had at home, because of the type of conversations we would have. But it wasn't until he actually passed away when I was 15 years old that I learned from people who came to his funeral about his political past. And in a sense, it was kind of like this introduction to my father when I was 15. It actually pushed me hard to kind of start my own kind of, in a sense, political career or life. I started just distributing articles in my, local neighborhood. People thought at the time that I was crazy, that maybe the intelligence have sent me to trap people. But I mean, soon, they realized that, it was genuine, that I'm actually really trying in my own way to educate people about what's going on. And I felt this is the impact I can have. Fast forward, of course, in 2011, the uprising started. As I was looking to see what I can do best to help, I found that civil journalism is the best way to help. I was a very good English speaker, and there wasn't a lot of media coverage for what was happening, especially in Damascus. So in the first couple of months, I've engaged with international media, just talking about what's happening in the demonstrations, what the regime response is, but more importantly, what people were looking for, their demands and their asks in the protests happening in Damascus and across all of Syria. I was detained twice, went under torture, was released, and then when the government tried to arrest me the third time, I escaped arrest, leading them basically to try to kidnap my little brother, my 16 years old brother at the time, to try to force me to deliver myself in. So eventually I had to leave Syria. I left the country to Beirut, took my little brother, then Egypt, and then eventually I made it to the US in 2013. Since then, I've been interested more in the policy work, but I've used my kind of business background in monitoring and evaluation in the policy world. I've been researching specifically a specific type of research called atmospheric reporting, where I basically look at the environment where specific policy projects are implemented, and then I assess how policy needs to change based on how the environment is changing. And I did that in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. And in a sense, that kind of taught me on one hand, actually, it helped me on one hand to really expand my networks, my connections across the region. It helped me understand more local dynamics, what people are really looking for when they think about policy change, but also allow me to understand how different policymakers actually think about foreign policy problems, and how they actually translate big policy problems into kind of like a puzzle game where they take piece by piece basically to try to solve this puzzle, leading me to where I am now.
Wow, you have an incredible, incredible story and so inspirational, Qutaiba. Can you tell us a little bit, obviously that traumatic experience being imprisoned, I can only assume that you were tortured. What did that trauma teach you about one of Assad's biggest backers, the Islamic Republic of Iran?
I mean, I think the main lesson I got from my experience under torture in prison is that the way the Assad regime was managing the sector wasn't really chaotic. There has been kind of like more intention to the way they do things, whether it is the torture tools, the methodology, their methodology of doing torture. I remember, for example, in one instance, torturers basically showed me one tool they had where they remove fingernails, and the way they do it, they don't just use like a clappers, but they actually use something kind of like a metal toothbrush where they press on the flesh of the finger to push the nail out. And the way they explain it as they are trying, to horror me, is that this way is actually much more painful than just trying to remove the nail itself. But again, this sort of thinking kind of like gives you an insight of how much there is also sophistication, even in the tools of and the methodology of torture. I think I did after I left. That was kind of fascinating for me. After I left, I started doing more research on how was that built, what were the roles of, as you said, external actors in there in helping building that system. And I think there are two leading evidence on how did this come together. I think the first one is the help that the Assad regime got from Eastern Germany, from former Nazi officers who escaped to the region back in the 60s, that helped kind of like build the methodology of how the system works. But the second one is actually an Iranian effort that started in 2001 under a project called al-Ghadir project, where really the Iranian government engaged with the Assad regime, on one hand to reorganize the whole security infrastructure, basically also have access to more data, who's doing what, but also it was very much an advisory role where they took leadership on how those different methods are used, whether in the security sector or the military sector.
Wow, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. That couldn't be easy. And as somebody who suffered this way, do you in any way, how do you view the Islamic Republic of Iran? Do you blame them for what you went through and for what your people are going through?
I mean, I think more personally, I'm very much focused on what Syria is going through. I mean, I think different people take this experience in different way. I think I was lucky enough to focus less on what I've been through, but to focus more on the conditions themselves and what actually the rest of the Syrian people are going through. I think definitely the problem we have with Iran, it's not about personal revenge for like what people like me have been through. I think the problem is the fact that such a system exists, where it is okay to go to send people through such system, and that the problem is that system continues to exist where maybe generations of people have to go through that. I think the lesson I've learned is that it is not okay that, for example, me and my father has gone through that system and that the buck stops here, that we need to do a change where this doesn't actually go to generations after. It's needless to say that without the support of the Iranian regime, and it's actually even not only militarily on the ground, on a security level, in its advisory role that led the regime's violent response to the uprising since 2011. But also, it was Qasem Soleimani who actually traveled to Russia and convinced Russia to intervene militarily in Syria as a standoff against the US. There are a lot of conversations about, Russia's interest in Syria, but Russia's interests in Syria were not really as cemented as they were in 2015. It is actually the efforts by the Iranian regime that helped Russia cement those interests, whether it is by intervening militarily and contributing to the violent response by the Assad regime to the public demands, or what turned later into basically building Russia's main military base and access to the warm waters.
Wow, so it was really the Islamic Republic of Iran that pushed Russia into having that kind of involvement, which is so vital with what we're seeing today. Now, when we go back to the Syrian civil war in 2011, Syria was so much front and center in the headlines, in headline news. And then it sort of almost, for whatever reason, disappeared. And at the time, there was a Reuters report that kind of digged into Iran and its role in Syria, how they saved Assad from the uprisings, but it seemed like in exchange, Syria almost kind of gave part of its country to Iran. So, for example, the report looked into Syria giving phosphate mines to Iran, 5,000 hectares of land for farming, 1,000 for oil and gas. During this period of time that Syria kind of, I guess, stepped away from the headlines for whatever reason, what was Iran doing in your homeland socially and economically?
Definitely. So, in a sense, as soon as the military operations calmed down, especially towards between 2017 and 2020, when it was clear that Russia's intervention has really helped in bringing kind of like at least some winning back of what Assad has lost in the earlier years of the war. Since then, the Iranian regime has been focusing more, in a sense, on getting its pound of flesh from the Assad regime. As you know, the regime in Iran extended a credit line and billions of dollars to the Assad regime, even though while Iranians were going through an economic hardship in Iran, it also sent large shipments of oil and extended different kinds of support to the Assad regime, totaling to around $50 billion over the last decade. So as soon as things calmed down, again, the regime was looking for its pound of flesh, and it tried to get that through different ways. So one, basically through through the regime in Syria signing off its strategic infrastructure, whether that is in some of the energy sector and the medical sector, and also, as you said, in some of the natural resources sector, basically signing off those contracts to IRGC-linked companies for the next 30 years, but also signing memorandum of understanding with different companies, part of the IRGC structure that actually allows Iran the biggest piece of the reconstruction, if that ever to happen in Syria. So in a sense, that was kind of like the guarantee through which the Iranian regime was trying to gain back some of its investment in Syria. But we have to keep in mind it's not all about the money, of course. The Iranian regime has invested a lot in Syria and in Assad because it is the runway, it is the land bridge that helped Iran extend support to its allies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, but also allows Iran to really pursue its regional hegemony by actually trying, to use Syria as a land bridge to other places. As we've seen since 2019, there has been an extensive Iranian effort through the IRGC to try to get to Jordan through Syria, using illicit networks. They've been trying to smuggle weapons and build networks within Jordan to try to have more influence over the country. So there's definitely that more strategic sense of why Syria is important to the regime beyond just the economics.
And is Iran losing that presence? I mean, you mentioned the $50 billion that Assad owns. There are rumors, I don't know what you make of this, but that Assad is trying to kind of pull away from Iran. There are some signs, like for example, he didn't attend President Ebrahim Raisi's funeral back in May. He, of course, was the Iranian president who died in a helicopter crash, and Syria was recently reinstated last year into the Arab League, which is another kind of move that potentially he's trying to get closer to these Arab states. Has Iran lost its presence, or is Syria trying to back away, I guess, and make new friends in the region, so to speak? Or is it too little too late for that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that Assad has been trying at least to create a show where to say that he is stepping away from Iran. I don't think Assad has ever been interested to step away from Iran because Iran is the ally he can depend on for the survival of his family and his regime. And I'll bring actually one example. Back in 2009, there has been a secret track where the US was pursuing indirect negotiations between Syria and Israel. The track basically was built on the idea that Syria will get back the Golan Heights in return for Assad to cut ties with Iran, and IRGC presence in Syria, and cut support for Hezbollah in Lebanon. Ambassador Fred Hoff, who led actually this track back in the day, published actually a book about the details of those negotiations. What was interesting in the negotiations that as soon as that proposal came together after a couple of years of back and forth between Tel Aviv and Damascus, Assad immediately said yes to abandoning Iran and abandoning allyships with Hezbollah. Yes. Which was interesting because for Fred Hoff in his book actually describes that it was an indication that Assad was never serious about it. Because if he was serious about it, he would have at least indicated how hard would that be, how difficult it would be to try to deliver on that. But he basically just immediately, oh yeah, absolutely, will deliver on that, and Iran has no choice. What's interesting is this year, like 10 years or like 12 years after this incident, as you know, Israel has bombed a lot of Iranian targets in Syria, including a 3.5 kilometers tunnel connecting Al-Qusayr and Homs to Lebanon. And what was very interesting is that tunnel was actually started to being built when Assad was having those negotiations with the US and Israel. So
Oh
at the
my.
same time, Assad was telling the United States that he's willing to completely cut off ties with Iran and completely get the IRGC out of Syria. He was building a 4 kilometers tunnel between Syria and Lebanon to make sure whatever smuggling, basically that supply line to Hezbollah, remains in place. So I think the rumors you mentioned, has been some regional countries who are trying to pursue that track, along with some allies in Washington, basically where sanctions would be lifted in return for Assad to help push the Iranians out. But I think it's very false assumption to assume that Assad would really abide by such a deal. But also, I think we have more evidence now by the latest operation we've seen from the coalition, the rebels coalition that started its offensive a week ago. If Assad was incapable of stopping a group of rebels who have been cut off from international support for almost now 10 years, who've been in one small pocket of Syria for the last 4 years with hard economic conditions, if Assad was not really able to stop this group of rebels from now taking control of the second and fourth largest cities in Syria, I don't know how Assad is going to be able to stop Iran from actually being from Syria or to cut the land bridge to Hezbollah, even if he was actually willing to.
And what does that all say about Assad himself?
I'll go back to Fred Hoff's book about this. From international perspective, interlocutors who've dealt with Assad for long, they would tell you Assad the father was very hard to deal with, very hard to negotiate with, but he was an honest man. Assad the son was very easy to deal with, but he was a lying SOB, as many diplomats
Like, I'm
describe.
sorry, so opposites, okay.
Yeah, exactly. So he does have the reputation of being a big liar, basically, where no one can really trust like a word that comes out or any promise or commitment that he makes for sure.
Speaking of promises and commitments, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi was recently quoted in a UK-based outlet called Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, saying that if Assad requests Iranian troops on the ground, we would consider it. What do you make of that?
I think both Iran and Russia are trying to show at least some public solidarity position with Assad. That would really compensate for the lack of actual support they are able to extend to Assad today. I think Iran specifically is in a hard position today because on one hand they've been overstretched, they are really undermined because of the continuous Israeli attacks in Lebanon and in Syria. They understood finally now that their 8 years long operations in Syria against the Syrian people have exposed them to Israeli intelligence, which has been collecting information, military locations, information about personnel throughout all of those years. So they understand that the more they get involved, the more exposed they can be. But also, and more importantly, logistically, it's very hard now for Iran to provide the support that Assad really needs. Not necessarily because Iran does not have it, and Iran may have those means, but because it's becoming really hard to transfer those means into Syria. Israel has put a lot of red lines into Iranian shipments of weapons and fighters into Syria for the fear that basically those shipments of fighters and weapons would actually go to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iraq has closed its borders under American pressure and even prevented the Popular Mobilization Force, the Iranian-linked militias basically in Iraq from crossing into Syria. So yes, Iran still have control over Syria, but that land bridge is not completely operational right now with the situation in Lebanon. So that's why Iran finds itself in a place where it wants to actually, of course, provide support for Assad, but it really is incapable right now of even finding an airport in Syria where it can land any sort of military support for Assad.
That's fascinating. So, do you feel that Iran has lost its grip on Syria?
That's a big question, I think, for the next few days. Today, the rebels entered Hama city and took over its surrounding military bases. Hama is very important because, of course, it's a political and symbolic value as one of the first cities who rose against Assad in the 60s and 70s. So that's very important symbolically for the Syrian people. But it's also very important because it has been used as the launch pad for all the military operations towards northwest Syria in the last 10 years. So, with the loss of Hama, Assad has really lost its air and land launch pad for its operations in the north, which means that in the counterattacks, Assad can really focus now on central Syria. But northern Syria is relatively safer right now from any counterattacks from Assad. So that's, I think, very important to take into consideration. As we're talking, the rebels are now advancing towards Hom's countryside, which again is set up a new test also for both the rebels and the regime. If the regime is not able to stand in Homs, then there isn't many stops actually left coming to Damascus. If we want to talk militarily, the rebels have won equipment and heavy weaponry in the last week, almost similar to what they've won from Assad in the first 40 years of the war itself. Just evidenced by the open source intelligence we're seeing from the takeover of military installations, of tanks, and even now airplanes from the Assad regime. So really the capability of Assad to really launch a counterattack is really decreasing. That puts both Iran and Russia in a very difficult situation in Damascus. I think the biggest question we're all waiting for an answer for is when would Russia actually comes to the survivor of both Assad and Iran in Syria? The biggest question is what is the red line for Russians? Is the red line for Russians its base in the coast, basically its presence in Syria's coast, or is it actually the regime in Damascus? There is no doubt that both Russia and even regional allies of the regime have been really tired of the stubbornness of the Assad regime throughout the last 8 years since 2016. Both regional countries and Russia have extended military, economic, and political support for the Assad regime. And in response, Assad has not really provided anything back. The Arab Communication Group that was established after the readmittance of Syria into the Arab League in 2022 have just asked for Assad to deliver on 2,000 on accepting 2,000 refugees from Jordan, on stopping Captagon trade, and on working on limiting the activities of foreign militias in Syria. Maybe it's hard for Assad to deliver on the third, or it's impossible for Assad to deliver on stopping Iran in Syria, but he could have at least worked on accepting some refugees, setting up the conditions for them to return, and actually stopping the trade of Captagon. None of that was delivered in the last 2 years. So in a sense, I wonder if some in Russia, specifically in the Kremlin, are thinking maybe enough is enough. Maybe we've invested a lot in Assad. We have an important base in Syria's coast in Latakia and Tartus that seems to be protected so far, that the rebels seem they have not indicated that they're going to actually attack those areas. So maybe the Russians can keep that, and then it's a question of when would Assad really provide any concession where the country can move forward politically without more violence.
Just how important is Syria for Iran? You mentioned the constraints that Iran is under, and of course, Russia, its ally, that it's being stretched thin right now. Is this the hill? Is Syria the hill that Iran is willing to die on, so to speak?
Absolutely, yes. Iran's real borders, from the Iranian regime's perspective, are not in Iran. Iran's borders are in Syria. Because without Syria, Iran is left really confined to its borders, even if it does have access to Iraq. It doesn't really have, the importance and the access and the ability to support malign activities across the region, especially across the Levant. So without Syria, the regime would really lose a lot of its intelligence and military capabilities and leverage over countries in the region. So the question, and if they lose Syria, how much leverage can the Iranian regime hold against regional powers who've been challenging Iran at times, or even trying to work with Iran other times, because of that influence it has in Syria?
Wow. And you mentioned earlier that as of now, sending Iranian troops isn't necessarily feasible. But if Syria is the hill that Iran is willing to die on, do you then foresee in the near future Iranian, boots on the ground in Syria fighting for Assad?
I don't think Iran will ever stop from trying to send troops. Iran has been trying for the last week through Iraqi militias, through moving some of its own militias in Syria, through actually trying to send more Afghanis and, from Rojava and Fatimiyun and other groups, from Afghani communities, refugee communities, and even from Afghans in Afghanistan, to send those to Syria. It's just because of the situation post the ceasefire in Lebanon, because of the situation regarding the war between Hezbollah and Israel putting a lot of restrictions and threatening any shipment from Iran. Iran finds itself in this difficult position, but I don't think Iran will stop looking for a solution. I think they're actively trying to break some of those boundaries to be able to provide the support to Assad. Let's say Iran is capable of managing some way to get what it needs for Assad in Syria, which again, as I mentioned, it's almost very hard for Iran to do right now. The problem is, even though when Iran did that back in between 2011 and 2014, it was able to slow down the collapse of Assad, but it wasn't able to stop it. And Iran had then to call on Russia to come for the help of both Iran and Assad in Syria. So I think even if they do, if they are able to extend the support and actually, send forces there, of course, first, I doubt that you will find a lot of Iranians willing to die for the regime in Syria. So that will be a challenge for the regime itself. But again, even if they're capable of getting, from Afghani militias and Iraqi militias, today that is not enough for the regime to slow down. It might slow down the collapse of the regime, but it's not enough for the regime to revive and take back what it's lost.
How would you characterize the relationship now between Syria and Iran?
So the regime basically is it's an interesting relationship because they are surviving on the presence of each other, and I think without Syria, the Islamic regime in Iran can't really entertain the same leverage in the region, and without Iran and the Islamic regime in Iran, the Assad regime cannot really survive. It is the end of the Assad regime. So it's really they really have this survival relationship where one depends on the other, and that's why, as we mentioned earlier, it's really hard to imagine any scenario where it is possible really for Assad to break that relationship. Assad might definitely try to pretend to break that relationship on a short and medium term. But again, as we know from all the records we have from Assad, that would only be temporary and just creating a show. But the relationship would definitely continue.
And just how are you feeling right now as a Syrian who had to flee your country? What is going through your mind, through your heart, your emotions? Describe to us your feelings.
It's really hard to catch up actually emotionally with what's happening. We walk up to this operation on Wednesday. By Friday, basically, Aleppo was liberated. And now on Wednesday, Hama, the fourth largest city, is taken, and the rebels are moving towards Homs. Not even in 2011, people were dreaming of that happening, let alone basically this is happening in a matter of a week almost. So yeah, I think that the emotions are not catching up much on with what's happening. I'm definitely worried about, again, what would be the position of Russia and where Russia's red line would be, where they would decide to shift resources from Ukraine to Syria. So that is something to keep an eye on. I'm worried about Assad and Iran basically trying to use chemical weapons again against the Syrian people. We know they've done that throughout the last decade, so I'm really worried about that possibility as well. But to be honest, I think more than most, I'm really proud of the Syrian people. It's been now almost 14 years since the uprising in 2011, and children who were 10 years old back then in 2011 are the young men basically who are still taking the fight now against the regime and against Iranian militias in Syria. And it really shows you how much, the cause of freedom, of building a democratic country, of building a new Syria for Syrians, is a cause now that is not taking completely, separate generations. It's just transferring organically, from one Syrian to another. And seeing also, to be honest, I'm very proud of the conduct of the rebels so far in the last week. We know in any war situation, there will be violations of international humanitarian laws. There will be violations against civilians because holding a weapon gives you power. But I'm really proud actually of the conduct so far, of the treatment of minority communities, of Christians, of Shia Ismailis, and of Druze and other communities. It shows a lot of growth. It shows a lot of sophistication. It shows a lot of realpolitik in a sense among the rebels that I think should really be appreciated from the international community, because we haven't seen something like that in general, when we look at non-state actors. I can't think of an example where we have seen like such development and such action on the ground on that level, which is something to be really appreciated. And as I mentioned, like one of the examples, as for example, the rebels were advancing to Hama yesterday. There's an important town, Salamiyeh. It's kind of like the hometown or the capital for Shi'at Ismaili in Syria. The rebels reach out to the Aga Khan, the fourth, and they actually arranged an agreement where the rebels would not enter the town, and basically they would neutralize the town from supporting the regime to prevent any fighting and any casualties among its residents. And they provided assurances for protections and everything for the town to remain as is, which I think, again, it's fascinating in the sense that, this has been taken consideration. We've seen a lot of statements from the rebels towards the Alawite community, calling them basically to not connect their fate with the fate of Assad. Even in Aleppo city, as the rebels have left the city, ordered all of their fighters out of the city. Governance structures are now taking over to make sure services are delivered. And they announced an amnesty for everyone who was affiliated with the Assad regime. There were pictures today from Aleppo where lines of hundreds of people, former police officers, army officers, government officials, are standing in line to get new IDs, basically to get an agreement where they will be forgiven for all of their service with the regime before. It shows really a level of, again, as I said, realpolitik and sophistication we haven't seen before, and makes me actually very hopeful for what the future will bring for the Syrian people if this moves forward as we hope.
You spoke of hope just now. Do you think that one day soon you'll have a chance to go back on Syrian soil?
I hope so. I mean, maybe Aleppo first, and then we see where would that take us. But yeah, definitely would love to be there one day sooner than later. But more than for myself, I'm speaking to you in a comfortable place here in Washington, and of course, Washington is a home to me. But also, I think it's more about the millions of Syrians who are still living in displacement camps. I'm very excited for them to actually return home. I can't imagine what it would be to live in a tent for over 12 years now, and the impact that is having on hundreds of thousands of Syrian families in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, inside Syria. So I'm very excited for those people to be able to return home safe. And to be able to live, their lives in their homes. I've been watching videos of people coming back, crying at the doors of their houses, kissing the doors of the knobs on the door, and just really it shows you kind of even this relationship people have to the constants, to the stones, to the places where they've spent their lives in. So yeah, I'm very excited about many Syrians having the ability to live that moment for sure.
Yeah, I saw the video, I think it was on Twitter, of the two brothers that were reunited after
Oh my
so many
God,
years. Yeah.
Yes. There are so many, as the rebels now enter Hama, and they got to the central prison there. So they released some of the political prisoners there, and some of them have been there since 1984.
84.
1984, yes.
Wow. Well, and thank you.
Imagine, what those people have
God.
been living through, being behind bars just for their opinions because they stood against the regime for all of this time.
And thank you for mentioning, as you said, the millions of Syrian refugees that have been living in tents for 12 years. Unfortunately, I feel like the world has forgotten about them. So thank you for bringing that up. And thank you for your time today, Qutaiba Idlbi. And it's your birthday, so happy birthday. Thank you for joining us on your birthday. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave us a comment. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.